Hi guys, and welcome to the fourth lecture for chapter 1. Today we'll be going over ecosystem services. Now, ecosystem services are a little bit abstract and it can be a little bit difficult to conceptualize, but we're going to try and break it down as simply as possible for you guys so that it's easy to digest and easy to understand. Basically, the ecosystems do a lot for us that we might not consider. The environment does a lot for us that we might not consider. There are things that the environment provides for us or regulates for us that we don't really consider. We just sort of take it for granted. And so in an effort to add economic value to ecosystems as a way to preserve them, scientists measured various ecosystem services and attached dollar values to them, which is very hard to do, so that it would incentivize us to avoid destroying those ecosystems or degrading those ecosystems, and it provides us with a way of understanding and appreciating ecosystems and what they provide for us. So with that in mind, ecosystem services are essentially the many and varied benefits that humans freely gain from the natural environment and properly functioning ecosystems. So these are services and resources that the ecosystems provide us with, that which we depend on, and in order for ecosystems to provide these services to us, they have to be healthy and they have to be well functioning. So if we degrade ecosystems beyond the point to where they're no longer healthy, they can no longer provide the ecosystem services that we depend on. Now, there are 4 different types of ecosystem services. They're very broadly defined, and they're going to be the categories that we're going to be talking about are provisioning services, regulating services, cultural services, and supporting services. Now, provisioning services are probably the easiest conceptually to understand out of all the different categories of ecosystem services. Provisioning services are broadly defined as products which are obtained from healthy ecosystems directly for humans to exploit for material or economic gain. So these are either material or energy outputs that we directly extract from an ecosystem. So it's pretty cut and dry, right? Provisioning services could be any sort of material, things like timber for construction supplies, food such as seafood or game from the woods or the ocean. It can be things like fresh water from reservoirs, or it could be medicine from different types of plants. And in addition to that, it could be different energy outputs. For example, hydroelectric power from rivers would be an ecosystem service, a provisioning ecosystem service from a moving river. So provisioning services are very direct benefits that we get from different ecosystems, and they are either material benefits or they are direct energy benefits. So while provisioning services are basically just natural resources provided by ecosystems, regulating services are a little bit more abstract. Basically, regulating services are broadly defined as benefits obtained through the regulation of ecosystem services by healthy functioning ecosystems. And so what regulating services do is it sort of maintains the environment in its current condition for other life to thrive. And remember, as we discussed in the introduction, the environment extends to the human and the urban environment as well. It extends to our cities, it extends to our societies, it extends to us. And so regulating services control different aspects of the environment, either in the woods or in your home or in your city, that allow us to survive and thrive. And so examples of regulating services would be local climate control and air quality. So for example, plants around us control the weather through evapotranspiration. Essentially, they release water into the atmosphere, which goes up into the higher levels of the troposphere. It condenses into rain and it falls back on us. It's no surprise that, for example, the tropical rainforest, some of the most productive ecosystems on the planet, also have heavy rainfall. They actually create their own rain because they're such a biologically productive ecosystem. They actually put the water into the air in the first place that allows it to condense and then fall back down to earth. So different plants and different healthy ecosystems can influence local weather. They can also provide clean air. So a lot of plants, obviously through photosynthesis, will take in carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and they will photosynthesize in order to produce sugar, and as a byproduct produce oxygen for us and any other organism to breathe. So this is yet another ecosystem service. In addition, and this is especially important in the wake of climate change change and CO2 emissions by humans, ecosystems do a lot to store carbon in the ground. So when they take that CO2 from the air in order to photosynthesize, they incorporate that CO2 and that carbon specifically into their own body tissues, and they then sequester that carbon, so they store it in the ground where it can't be sent into the atmosphere and contribute to climate change and global warming. This is going to be something, a theme that we're going to be going over again and again in this class, is the influence of carbon dioxide and global warming, so you might as well just get used to it now. In addition to all of that, soil maintenance, for example, maintaining clean, healthy soils so that we can grow things in them is another benefit of regulating ecosystem services. In addition to that, root rhizomes from plants control erosion. Different pollinators will pollinate our crops for us so that they can bloom and produce fruit that we use to eat food, and they can also treat wastewater. So for example, if we have dirty or polluted water and we run it through a wetland, wetlands are really valuable in that they filter out pollutants and get rid of them for us. So we can go on and on about the many regulating services that ecosystems provide, but I just wanted to give you guys a few of them. So just keep in mind that the environment that we like to live in is controlled and is in part dictated by the healthy functioning ecosystems due to the regulating services that they provide. Moving to some of the more abstract services of ecosystems provide, we're now going to talk a little bit about cultural services. And cultural services refer to some of the non-material benefits that healthy ecosystems provide. And these can be things like education, so the benefit of learning from an ecosystem by actually visiting it; recreation, the benefits, the spiritual or emotional benefits that we get from being able to use and see and interact with ecosystems. For example, for me, I love going diving, and so the non-material benefits that I receive from being able to dive in a healthy ecosystem or go running through a nice trail. If you like running at the conservation park over in Panama City Beach, that is a perfect example of some of the benefits that you get from the ecosystem service of that wilderness. So in addition, there are also spiritual ecosystem services, so the benefits that certain indigenous peoples or anyone who's religious or spiritual get, those spiritual benefits that those individuals get from those healthy functioning ecosystems. And then finally, tourism. Panama City Beach is a great example of the cultural service of tourism. Basically, people pay good money to go visit and look at the beach, and if the beach didn't look very nice, or if we didn't maintain the beach to where the beach degraded into a nasty ecosystem, people would stop wanting to come there, and because they would no longer be receiving the cultural services benefits of the healthy beach and ocean ecosystems. So these are some of the examples of cultural services. I know they're a little abstract, but just keep in mind that anything that is emotional, spiritual, or educational that an ecosystem provides that we can't really tack down a monetary value to, that is probably going to be a cultural ecosystem service. Now, finally, perhaps most abstract is the supporting services. And supporting services are basically the foundation of ecosystems. And so they're broadly defined as ecosystem services which make it possible for all other ecosystem services to exist in the first place. So these ecosystem services are responsible for maintaining the ecosystems themselves so that the ecosystems can then provide benefits to the rest of us through the other ecosystem services that we mentioned. So and this can be very difficult to understand, but if these supporting services did not exist, the ecosystems would be unhealthy, and therefore they wouldn't be able to provide the provisional, regulating, and cultural services that we actually rely on. So while we don't necessarily take advantage of supporting services directly, we take advantage of them indirectly through the exploitation of the other ecosystem services that we talk about. So basically think of supporting services as the backbone or basic baseline of ecosystem services, because without supporting services, none of the other ecosystem services would exist in the first place. And so examples of supporting services are nutrient cycling. Basically, organisms in an ecosystem will break down decaying biomatter, like mushrooms, for example, on the top right-hand side of your screen. Those mushrooms will break down old decomposing tree matter and return those nutrients to their mineral form so that they can be absorbed by other plants and animals. In addition to that, habitat provision. For example, we wouldn't be able to harness wildlife, basically wouldn't be able to go hunt game, or we wouldn't be able to fish for fish or any other seafood if the oceans and if the woods didn't provide a habitat for those animals. So while the provisioning service is food, either in game or the form of seafood, the supporting service that facilitates that provisional service is the supporting service of habitat. So you see how we don't exploit the supporting service directly, but we do so indirectly by accessing the service that is facilitated through that supporting service. I hope that's easy for you guys to understand. Finally, things like primary production and genetic diversity basically are things that allow bodies of animals, populations of animals to maintain healthy individuals. These are, again, going to be very important because when we try to tap into some of the provisional services of, for example, game or soils or crops or plant matter, we need that genetic diversity and we need that primary production as a way of facilitating those additional services. So these are examples of supporting services, and I know it can be a little abstract, so if you have any questions about any of this material specifically, I'm happy to meet with you via Skype or talk to you over the phone or email and see if I can clarify any of this service in particular, because I know it can be a little bit tricky to understand. And so when we think about ecosystem services, over and over again, I want you to understand that no ecosystem service is possible without the ecosystem being healthy and functioning in the way that it has always been and the way that it's supposed to. So services and resources that the ecosystems provide, which we depend on, require healthy and well-functioning ecosystems. If an ecosystem becomes unhealthy for any reason, they often lose the ability to provide the services that we rely on. And this becomes a problem because remember that if the environment is doing it for us, or if ecosystems are doing something for us, it's free. But if we have to replicate those services that the ecosystems provide for free, it can be expensive, incredibly expensive, or sometimes outright impossible to replicate via a man-made mechanism. So if the ecosystems aren't healthy enough to provide ecosystem services, we have to figure out a way to do it, and that can be incredibly expensive to do so. And we're going to go over an example of this when we look at clean water. And so, like I just said, we'll be going over clean water, the provisioning service of clean water to bathe, drink, and use for personal or industrial use as an ecosystem service that can be lost if the provisioning ecosystem is degraded. So currently we get our water from the Floridian aquifer, with the exception of Bay County, which is literally the only county which gets the majority of their water from surface reservoirs from Deer Point Lake. The rest of Florida gets the majority of their water through the Floridian aquifer, and you can see the Floridian aquifer in the map on the top left corner of your screen. And the aquifer is essentially these underground passages of porous rock and underwater tunnels that essentially have formed over millions and millions of years. Essentially, water over millions of years percolated through the ground and eventually eroded little canyons and pore space and crevices inside of the limestone rock beneath us right now, because the majority of Florida sits underneath limestone. And so over time, it essentially filled these huge caverns. As it worked its way through all of the limestone acted essentially as a filter and filtered the water of all of its nasty byproducts. And so as a result of that, the water from the Floridian aquifer is very, very clean. So right now, how we access clean water is we simply stick a pipe down into the ground, deep underground, and we pump up the water. So the cost right now is essentially incredibly low compared to what it otherwise would be. The cost right now per liter of water is simply the cost to pump the water out of the ground, which is really, really cheap. However, While currently that's a thing, we are in danger of losing this aquifer and other aquifers around the world. Essentially, when we pump water out of the aquifer faster than it can be replaced, there is no longer any water holding up the rock, holding the rock above it, and so the rock begins to collapse under its own weight when we remove the water from underneath it. So there's nothing supporting the rock anymore, and so it begins to cave under its own pressure. And we see this in two basic mechanisms. The first is really passive. It's called subsidence. Essentially, the land or the surface subsides. It is compacted under its own weight. And so you can see, like on the little schematic and the graphic over here in the center of your screen, where it essentially, the ground collapses under its own weight, and you can essentially see the ground sinking in real time as you take pictures throughout the years. And this is far more gradual. Something that's a little bit worse is the example of sinkholes. So what happens is, in particular, when we pump all of the water out of an area where enormous tunnels have been erected, where the water has basically washed away or eroded a huge amount of limestone, and it's basically a giant arch. So you have land and then a huge amount of water underneath, sort of like how you see on the right-hand side of your screen. When that water is pumped out, there's nothing holding that ground up, and so it can collapse all at once. And that is essentially one of the ways that sinkholes are formed. And so not only do we lose the aquifer and the ground subsides, but it can also damage homes, damage infrastructure, and kill people if we're not careful about it. And the thing that we need to understand is that once an aquifer compacts, once the land subsides, the aquifer is no longer usable. That pore space is gone, and it will take millions of years for the water to re-erode new channels and new pathways. So this is a perfect example of an exhaustible renewable resource that we just talked about in the previous lecture. Once that land subsides, the resource that was originally provided is no longer able to be provided, and we have essentially used up all of that renewable resource. It is completely exhausted. So in addition to this, there is another way that we can kind of ruin our aquifers, and this is happening in real time, particularly in South Florida. Remember that the aquifer is nothing more than pore space, and especially in coastal areas, the way that salt water doesn't get into the aquifer is essentially because the aquifer is constantly forcing water out and into the ocean. So it's forcing water out and preventing salt water from coming in. However, if we take up too much groundwater, essentially that outward force, that outward pressure is no longer there. And when the pressure subsides, seawater can come back into the aquifer. And so when that happens, now the water is no longer pure and fresh. It's now somewhat salty to varying degrees. And so areas, in many parts of South Florida, particularly Miami, are having huge problems with what's called saltwater intrusion. Saltwater getting into the aquifer and causing it to be undrinkable and otherwise unusable because the salt corrodes all of the metal piping. It just ruins everything and all of the infrastructure that we use to pipe up that fresh water in the first place. So you can see how once we use up too much fresh water too quickly, we begin to exhaust that renewable resource and bad things begin to happen. So what we're going to do now is look at exactly how much money it would cost to manufacture or to produce that fresh water so that we could use it on our own. How much would it cost to create that fresh water if we no longer had an aquifer to do so for us? So right now we're going to go over a little exercise in order to understand exactly how much money it would cost to replicate the resource, the provisional resource of clean, fresh water. So we're going to look at the cost of replicating this ecosystem service using a desalination plant. What a desalination plant does is it takes salt water, usually from the ocean or the Gulf of Mexico, it puts it through a plant, it pushes the water through a membrane that filters all the salt water out, and it provides fresh water, and as a byproduct produces something called brine, which is super salty water. So it basically creates a bunch of fresh water and a byproduct of very, very, very salty water in addition to that. And so currently it would cost around $1 million to generate 1,000 cubic meters of water per day. And this comes out to around $1,000 per cubic meter of water. Now, that's a lot of water, but that's also a huge amount of money. And again, that's going to be if we had to replicate the ecosystem service of fresh, clean water if we did not have an aquifer. However, with an aquifer, the cost to pump in a neighboring county to Bay County, Walton County, where I worked at for a while, was essentially around $23 for 6,000 gallons of water. That comes out to around $23 for 23 cubic meters of water. So that is a lot less. It's $1,000 for 1 cubic meter of water, or it's about $1 for 1 cubic meter of water if we just pump it. So essentially what this comes out to is that the cost to replicate the ecosystem service of clean fresh water is about 1,000 times as expensive as just pumping it up from the ground. So if this tells you anything, it is a huge incentive to preserve the Floridian aquifer, because if we use it all up, water is going to get 1,000 times as expensive as what it currently is. Now, it might not always be 1,000 times more expensive. Desalination technology could improve and that cost might drop. However, it will still be far, far more expensive no matter how good the technology gets. It will always be more expensive than just pumping water out of the ground. And so that's just one way to illustrate how much money is attached to ecosystem services when humans have to replicate those services on their own. Now, this is everything that we have for you guys today. I hope you guys enjoyed the chapter or the lecture on ecosystem services. For the final lecture in chapter 1, we'll be going over sustainability and conservation. I'll see you guys then.